All right, the nervous system can be subdivided into two parts. We got the central nervous system, the CNS. We got the peripheral nervous system. Focusing on the peripheral nervous system, we can be subdivided even further into another two parts. We got the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. Subdividing the autonomic nervous system even further, we get the parasympathetic, which I'm going to write here as PNS, nervous system, and the sympathetic nervous system, which I'm going to write here as SNS. Subdividing the somatic nervous system, we have motor and sensory. The CNS can be further subdivided into the brain and spinal cord, but today we're going to focus on this somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system, as the two subdivisions imply, is mainly responsible for motor movements of skeletal muscle, things you can control, and sensory. Smell, touch, sight, hearing. Smell, touch, sight, hearing, taste. 5 senses. That's stuff you can control. The autonomic nervous system mainly deals with digestion, your heart rate, sweating, vasoconstriction, meiosis, things you can't necessarily control unless you take certain drugs. So, autonomic nervous system, things you can't really control. Somatic nervous system, movement, motor movement, and sensory. Well, now that we know sort of the difference, we're going to further talk about the two subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. Okay. But the parasympathetic nervous system, PNS, don't say it too fast, and sympathetic nervous system. This is called rest and digest. It's mainly responsible for functions that involve what I'm doing right now. I'm digesting, I just ate lunch. Resting. I'm not endangered. We're most of the time at this stage, rest and digest. It's responsible for digestion, decreasing your heart rate, other things. The sympathetic nervous system, it's also called fight, flight, or freeze, or fight or flight. We'll just call it fight or flight. Fight or flight. This is mainly responsible for, well, bringing your heart rate up whenever you go on a run, whenever you work out. This system gets activated. You sweat when you get too hot. You get goosebumps when you get scared. When you see a bear and you're freaking out, your pupils dilate. Well, it's thanks to this and the chemicals involved with this system. And the fact that we digest our food well and that we can sleep, that we can feed and nourish our bodies and get rid of waste is thanks to this system and the chemicals involved. Okay, now we're going to talk about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, now we're going to compare and contrast how the different systems work together. So the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, here we go. All right. The parasympathetic nervous system. And then we got the sympathetic nervous system. So they both use 2 neurons. I guess one thing I should have brought up is that the somatic nervous system only uses 1 neuron that will directly synapse on, say, skeletal muscle. Parasympathetic nervous system, so they use a 2 neuron system called a ganglion. So the preganglionic neuron for a parasympathetic nervous system neuron is going to be long, and the postganglionic neuron is going to be short. I dashed it to show that it's not myelinated. Conversely, for the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neuron is going to be short, and the post will be long. In the parasympathetic nervous system, it's fairly easy. They originate from the craniosacral region. 80% of PNS forms the vagus nerve. Now the craniosacral region is a region just below on the neck and a little bit below till about T1, and then the sacrum and the nervous system, the vagus nerve will come down and innervate all of these organs in the organs, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands in this thoracic cavity. The ones from the sacrum will come up and innervate the kidneys, bladder, these places. Okay. All right. Sympathetic nervous system is a little bit more complex. We have 4 different major routes. 4 routes. Okay. First route. We have the spinal nerve. So, one thing about the sympathetic nervous system is that it ranges from T1 down to L2 on the spine. Like this. And along the spine here are chain ganglia. So the spinal nerve is just the preganglionic neuron synapses on the so basically what happens with the spinal nerve, preganglionic neuron synapses right here, and then it'll synapse to it synapses on the pregang, and then the postganglionic neuron will go as a spinal nerve and synapse on the skin, hair follicles, sweat glands, and blood vessels. Okay. Now, another route. We have the sympathetic nerve. Okay. Now the sympathetic nerve will fire, preganglionic neuron will fire at the sympathetic chain ganglia, But then the postganglionic neuron, rather than going to these parts of the body, will go to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Above diaphragm. Okay, now we have another nerve called splanchnic nerve. And rather than the preganglionic neuron firing on the sympathetic chain ganglia, it'll go fire on the collateral ganglia, which will then target, the postganglionic neuron will then target smooth muscle and glands below diaphragm. So below this section, the diaphragm, right in here. Okay, that's the splanchnic nerve. Now, last but not least, there is another function called the greater splanchnic nerve. So this goes through collateral ganglia to adrenal medulla. And it'll fire on these special cells, and that will produce epinephrine. And we'll talk about epinephrine in a second. So here is the difference of the routes between the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. Got it down? Okay, sweet, because I'm going to erase it. Okay, here we go. All right. Okay. Now, you're asking the receptors. Perfect. So, preganglionic neurons, in both systems, this is one commonality that they have. Neurons into nicotinic receptors. They're ionotropic. Okay, so preganglionic neurons will synapse acetylcholine onto ionotropic nicotinic receptors on the postganglionic soma. And so that will initiate something down there. So those are receptors that is used in the junction between preganglionic neurons and postgang neurons. Okay, now for the receptors used by the parasympathetic nervous system. We have muscarinic receptors. They're cholinergic, which means they use acetylcholine. acetylcholine. Now, there's receptors used by the sympathetic nervous system. Receptors. All right, get ready for it. We have alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3. These are adrenergic receptors, or basically that means that they're stimulated by catecholamines. Or here we got epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. So that means these three neurotransmitters will activate these receptors. Now, one more interesting thing about dopamine is it will also activate D1 and D2, which are dopaminergic. But not vice versa. You can't take epinephrine, for example, and activate a D1 or D2 receptor. And these ones are mostly located in brain. These are located in the brain. Okay. So, this uses acetylcholine, cholinergic receptors, M1 through M5. Okay. Let's talk about how they work. And we'll do that next. Okay, the last part of this 3-part video, we're going to be talking about the different type of receptors that we just talked about and their mechanisms of action, how they work to initiate responses in the body. Okay, one more thing I forgot to mention is that sweat glands are actually activated by a muscarinic receptor, by acetylcholine, although they're part of the sympathetic nervous system. So that's just one thing I forgot to mention last time. But sweat glands are the only part of the sympathetic nervous system where they have muscarinic receptors and they are activated, or they cause sweating by acetylcholine. Okay. All right. Receptor classes. Here we go. We have one, works by activating IP3. Another one increases, another class increases camp. The last one decreases camp. Okay, increased camp, we have D1, beta 1, beta 2, beta 3. Decrease camp, we have alpha 2, M2, M4, and then D2. For IP3 pathway, we have alpha 1, and then we have M1, M2, M3. You might be asking, what is IP3? What is camp? We'll get to that in a second. These receptors work, they're metabotropic receptors, or they work via a G protein coupled receptor mechanism. So what a G protein coupled receptor looks like is here. So there's like 7 transmembrane domains. 6, 7, yeah, sweet, something like that. This is the receptor, and it's coupled to a G protein. And the G protein is called a G protein because it can autophosphorylate a GTP molecule, beta, gamma, and then you have your alpha subunit. And connect to that alpha subunit, deactivate it as GDP. Now, this G protein can work, well, these 3 different ways. And so, the IP3 pathway is one we're going to talk about first. There's something called PIP2 in here. It's a lipid. Then we have another player here, which is phospholipase C. Okay, so, all right, for IP3, one of these will bind, and then this will turn the GDP, alpha subunit will replace with GTP and become active. This will then activate that, and then since that is activated, PLC will cut, it's phospholipase C, so it will cut PIP2 into IP3 and DAG. DAG will stay in the membrane, and then it will activate some kinase, and then IP3 will go to the smooth ER, where it opens it up, a channel, and calcium floods the cell. And so that's how that receptor works. And then this calcium will team up with DAG and will activate another kinase, basically causing a muscle contraction. And so this pathway is excitatory. Oh, shoot, I put the wrong receptors there. That's my me. M1, M3, M5. M1, M3, M5 are IP3 pathways. So that's how that IP3 pathway works. Okay. Sweet, all right. Now we'll go to increasing camp. Okay, so we have our same deal. We have our G protein. Neurotransmitter will come here and bind. And then we have our gamma, beta, and then our alpha subunit. Same thing, GTP activates it. And then this guy will go and activate this protein in the membrane called adenylyl cyclase. This guy will activate it. Activates. And then adenylyl cyclase will take ATP and make cyclic AMP, CAMP, which will then go activate, and activate protein kinase A to do work in the cell. Again, this is an excitatory pathway mostly, besides the beta-2 receptors. Beta-2 receptors are inhibitory. Beta-2 we find in lungs, and upon their activation, they will cause bronchodilation. Sweet. Okay, that's that pathway. This pathway is the same, except rather than the alpha subunit activating camp, it inhibits. And so this never happens. And so as you can tell by the even number of the receptors, it's an inhibitory pathway. right. So those are three types of receptors that are used by the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. As a review, the ones that I circle are parasympathetic receptors. The rest are sympathetic receptors. Besides, I forget which one, but besides one of these muscarinic receptors, which can also be used by the sympathetic to activate sweat glands. Okay. So we got that, and now we also need to talk about, these are metabotropic receptors. We're just going to talk real quick about nicotinic receptors. Okay, for a neuron to send a signal, for a postganglionic neuron to synapse on a preganglionic neuron to synapse on a postganglionic neuron, we have our N2 receptor. And the N2 receptor is ionotropic. So that means upon binding acetylcholine, it'll open up a channel and allow the flow of ions. This flow of ions will initiate an action potential in the cell and down and allowing it to synapse. That's how the nicotinic receptor works. It's ionotropic, which means that rather than activate a G protein, which is a metabotropic pathway, it'll open up an ion channel, let ions in, thus allowing an action potential to propagate down the neuron onto some effector tissue. So yeah, that is roughly basic how the autonomic nervous system works to keep us alive.